Thank you. Hello.
It's alright, I didn't do it.
What? You didn't do it. The front row all nailed you there, I'm afraid, Lee. Sorry about that. Can I have a show of hands before I do this? How do we feel about profanity in here? I've got a couple of F words in this.
Love it.
Hands up if you think that's okay, if it's all right for me to use it in quoting somebody. Okay. When you're doing the Krays, it does kind of come into the picture a little bit. So I owe my life to Ronnie and Reggie. This is Ronnie, the nicer of the two. Britain's most notorious gangsters in the 60s. Photographed here by David Bailey in a photograph that kind of made him famous. That's Reggie in the back. Now, if he was mad, and the doctors later certified that he was, and they were certainly bad, and they were dangerous to know. They were born within 10 minutes of each other in the East End, but they were East End boys and West End hotel owners and nightclub owners. And they would attract the likes of Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra. So there was a massive sort of glamorous front to their business, but behind that business, there was protection rackets, there was hurting people who crossed them, there was creating connection through fear, there was do as you're told and nobody gets hurt, and aren't we pals now, and if we're not, I'll burn your house down, that kind of thing. And the reason I asked about the profanity, because one of the quotes from Ronnie in his autobiography, and they really were this famous. Me and my brother ruled London, we were fucking untouchable. Only they weren't, of course, were they? Because in the end, in May 1968, the police came knocking on the door of the council flat where Violet and Charlie Kray, the parents, lived, where these two boys were at that time in bed with a couple of girls. The parents were away, and they came knocking early in the morning and they arrested them. And they did them for murder. Now, they were sent down for murder, but their legend definitely lived on in the East End, where I'm from. And I want to make it clear, it really was a legend. It was full of lies and delusions and myths. But there was something about them that somehow seemed to stand for, to East End people, that business of persistence under pressure, of sticking it to the man, of not really taking authority. You know this myth of the Blitz thing, and it really is a myth, because the amount of house robbing and body robbing that went on in the darkness of the Blitz was extraordinary. But the myth of the Blitz that Churchill created and kind of used to browbeat the rest of the country, there was a kind of kernel of truth in it in the East End, in that we were people who wanted to play by their own rules. So for the Krays to become notorious, in a way, made them kind of folk heroes. And by the 70s and 80s, their people still ran crime in the area where I lived to a degree. And their name was certainly still feared. And the kind of stories that went around were they never hurt anybody except their own. Well, yeah, except, of course, for the ones they slashed. Like Jack the Hat McVitie, stabbed multiple times in the head and body by a frenzied Reggie. Hard to imagine, isn't it, looking at that picture? Or those they shot, like wild-haired Frank Mitchell, the mad axeman. He was sprung from prison by the firm, which was their gang, because they thought he would be useful. And he turned out to be too strong and too unmanageable and too unstable. So they shot him in the back of a van, and then they took him to the seaside, and they dumped his body out to sea. Or those they saw as rivals, like George Cornell, a member of the Richardson gang, who was shot by Ronnie, here, the lovely Ronnie, at the Blind Beggar pub in the Whitechapel Road. Only if you ever go as a kind of dark tourism thing, you might want to tell the tourists who go there and talk about where he was shot, that actually, when he was shot, the Blind Beggar pub was on the other side of the road. They loved their mum, though. It's important to remember that. That part of the legend was definitely true. They loved Violet obsessively, and she loved them just as much in return. There she is. with her lovely boys, as she called them. My lovely boys. She brought them up pretty much single-handedly for part of their childhood while their dad was on the run from the army. When she died in August 1982, Ronnie wrote a poem. I have it here. Would you like to hear it? Now then, let's not be condescending and let's not patronise his literary talents. He was a working-class man, remember that. Mum, you are like a rose. When God picked you, you were the best mum he could have chose. You kept us warm when it was cold. With your arms around us, you did fold. For us, you sold your rings of gold. When you died, I, like a baby, cried. When I think of you, it is with pride. So go to sleep, Mum. I know that you are tired. Now, actually, there is a poignancy to that, isn't there? From a man who was approaching 50 at the time and was inside Parkhurst prison for murder. And the twins, as everybody knew them, were allowed to attend Violet Krays' funeral at Chingford Old Church, making their first appearance in public since their arrest 13 years earlier. There was a thrill in the air. This is what the ITV News report said. Some of her family are regarded as the most evil villains London has ever seen. And that's where I come in, 15 years old, and scared of everything and everybody. Except this man. That groovy looking fella. This was taken at a works party. It's unfair, isn't it? 30 something years later to put up a picture of somebody at a works party. But that is John James, who was the editor of the Waltham Forest Guardian at the time. And he came to our school. And I have to tell you, I went to a terrible school. I went to a really, really terrible school. It was a war zone. You got beaten up if you read a book. John James came to our school and sat in the classroom, and to a kind of ocean of indifference, much like this, he told us that we could be journalists. Those were the days when you could join a local paper and become a journalist. Long gone days in many places. And John told us, if you become a journalist, there's a chance that you'll end up like Michael Parkinson. I mean, the obvious question to this man, who was dressed almost entirely like that, so at the time in his kind of 70s beige and his sideburns and his flares, he did look a bit odd to a bunch of us in skinny drain pipes with safety pins in our ears. He did. The obvious question is, why haven't you? Why are you sitting in a classroom of oiks who don't want to listen to you instead of being Michael Parkinson? But it didn't occur to us to ask that question. And I was thrilled at the thought of Michael Parkinson. Not because he had the biggest show on British television at the time, but because of this man. Yeah, right? The most beautiful, the most compelling, the most powerful in a good way, eloquent figure of his time, Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali had been on Michael Parkinson a couple of times. Okay? Now, I wanted to be Muhammad Ali. There were a couple of reasons why that career option was not open to me. And one of them was that I liked getting hit even less than I liked hitting people. But I thought, well, if I can't be Muhammad Ali, maybe I can be Michael Parkinson, the guy on the sofa with him, or the guy in the chair, those weird 70s chairs they had. So I sort of sidled up to the editor at the end and asked if I could come on work experience. And he was so pathetically grateful that anybody had paid any attention to any of it that he said yes. So why don't you come in a couple of weeks, come to the office and ask for Sandra. So I went to the office of the Waltham Forest Guardian and I asked for Sandra, and she showed me through to the newsroom. And it was the most intimidating, most adult place I'd ever been in my life. It was an open plan office of about 30 or 40 people. It really was the stone age when local newspapers had staff. And it was, the air was blue with cigarette smoke, of course it was. There was a thunderous clatter of manual typewriters. I'm so old, this was before the fax. I remember how excited we were when the fax arrived. And there was a kind of villainous creature over in the corner, a kind of wild-eyed looking Irishman called Alan, and he was very, very clearly the leader of the pack. And so they said, go over to Alan. I went over to Alan, and he had that look in his eyes that kind of said, what have you got to offer? But he also was quite welcoming. And on the second day of my work experience, he said, come with me to Violet Krays' funeral. Now, there's Ronnie. I zoomed in on that so that you could get a sense of the kind of interest that is going on. Look at those faces. I mean, this is the closest thing Chingford had seen to a royal visit, you know? It even looks like it, doesn't it? Bless you. Or maybe the Pope. Maybe he's got a ring. Maybe he's the Pope. And there's a combination of things about that. You know, these guys weren't Robin Hood. They were literally just robbing hoods. But they were still held in high regard or feared or were just stories, creatures of great story who people were fascinated by. And the police were intimidated by them. Look at the copper's face there. I mean, they're really worried that something's going to happen. They found the biggest bouncers they could find to stick Ronnie and Reggie into handcuffs because they were making their first public appearance for 13 years. And the hearse brought Violet Kray all the way from Bethnal Green, where she lived, up the road to Chingford. It's quite a long way. It takes a good half an hour if you're going at that pace. And all along the way, the road was actually lined with people for a mixture of motives. When they got to Chingford Old Church in August 1982, Alan, the news editor, had said to me, okay, here's a black jacket and here's a black tie. You don't look like a reporter. Go and gate crash the funeral. Yes, he was asking a child to gate crash the funeral of the most notorious men in Britain. And I was more frightened of him than I was of them, because I barely knew who they were, but I certainly knew who he was. And I wasn't going to do that, obviously. So I thought, yeah, okay, yeah. And I blended into the crowd. And then, like the Red Sea, the crowd parted. Because I was wearing a black jacket and a black tie, and none of them wanted to mess with anybody who was associated with the Krays. So suddenly there's a way through the crowd, and I'm just walking because I want to get away from Alan. That's my main motivation. And then I suddenly find myself approaching the church in the line of mourners. I get right up to the porch. I can smell 1,000 years of history and woodworm coming out of the church. I can see in there Ronnie's head and Reggie's head, and I can see the coppers, and I can see the very nervous priest. And it's dark, and then I realise that it's not dark because of the porch, it's dark because of the enormous gentleman who's just taken one step in front of me. And he was huge. I mean, I'm not small, but he was huge. And he had his arms crossed like that. And he had shades on, a bit like that. And he just looked down at me. He went, "You must be fucking joking." I ran fast. I ran through that crowd. The tie's coming off, the jacket's coming off. All the way back to Alan, who was killing himself laughing because he hadn't meant it. Because he was winding me up. And he said, "If you are prepared to gate crash the funeral of Ronnie and Reggie Kray's mum, I will give you a job." So I joined the paper, and when I say I owe my life to them, what I mean is my working life. Of course I do. I've been a journalist ever since, a writer ever since. There is a picture of Ronnie going into the funeral. That is Mick, the photographer, and that dark-looking, sinister, satanic figure there is Alan, the news editor. Now, the extraordinary thing, and it really blows my mind, is that this afternoon when I was looking for images to go with this story, I came across this one. And that's Reggie. And there's Mick. And there's Alan. And there's me. Looking terrified. It's just, I got such chills when I found that this afternoon. That's extraordinary. Anyway, I became a journalist, exactly like that. I was as heroic as that, and I smoked as much as that. And that, in the end, is why I owe my life to Ronnie and Reggie Krays.